Hi, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this video is a mini lecture on the creation myth genre, specifically as it relates to those stories in Genesis. So now I would like to share my screen so that we can see a PowerPoint I have developed as we pursue that discussion. First, let's back up a little bit and let's talk about the term myth. The term myth has come down to us to mean something untrue, something not supported by scientific fact, something that we would say, well, that's just a myth. But that is not the type of myth we are talking about when we talk about the genre of myth. Myth, therefore, is a genre of stories created to explain the unexplainable. That is to say that maybe somebody is sitting around outside looking up at the sky and go, I wonder why there are stars. I wonder what stars are made of. Or I wonder why an apple falls from the tree all the way to the ground, right? And so a myth is created to explain something that's often been observed using the, sort of belief systems of the time. Okay, so it doesn't mean untrue. It's something that's been created to explain something that the normal belief system does not allow of an explanation for. The creation myth then is a subgenre of myth, and it is developed essentially to develop the creation of the world and or humanity. And if you've done any study of mythology across the world, you will find that every known culture has at least one creation myth. The Bible offers us at least two creation myths, and those can be found in Genesis. But let's back up even further and let's think about the Bible itself. The Bible is sometimes read as a linear narrative from Genesis to Revelations. But the Bible is actually a library of books and should be considered that way. It is a library of books that has been compiled into a single volume known as the canon, which has been developed over at least 1,500 years. That is to say that the writings come from over 1,500 years, but the stories themselves are probably date over 3,000 years. Therefore, we can't read the Bible in the same way that we would say, like, read a novel or a history book. While it may often appear to be a linear narrative, that is the work of the compilers that have taken various books, deemed them to be appropriate, and put them in the Bible in a certain order. The canon, therefore, we have to talk about are those books that have been deemed authoritative and appropriate for the Bible by certain religious figures at different times to put into this work called the canon. There are books that have been included and there are books that have not been included. For example, the Apocrypha, which we'll be reading a few stories from as well. And for some reason, those books at the last minute were deemed not acceptable for the canon and therefore not included in the Bible. They still exist and they are considered extra canonical works. When we look at the Bible, we begin to see certain styles, certain patterns, certain ways of writing throughout all of the Bible. You're going to get multiple voices, multiple styles. And so we want to take a look particularly at the first 5 books of Moses, and particularly for this class, the Genesis. And why the first 5 books of Moses? Well, that would be the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And what we have found, what scholars have found, is that there appear to be at least 4 main strands of literary styles that work together to make up these 5 books. And scholars have put forth, therefore, this idea called the documentary hypothesis, which suggests that there are 4 author groups, editors, etc., that work together to interweave, right, these stories into these books. The first is the Yahwist. The Yahwist probably was writing around 950 BCE. The Yahwist represents God as Yahweh, which has come down to us in translation as Jehovah, and therefore is often called the J group, okay, and refers to God often as Lord when we are looking at the first 5 books. Then there is the Elohist author group, which refers to God as God, or in translation, it would have been Elohim. And this was probably written around 850 BCE, about 100 years later. There is the Deuteronomist author group, which I am not going to ask you to be able to identify because it's a little too tough to identify, but understand that that's more theoretical and that it posits a history of humankind that is based on whether or not they have pleased God. It also argues strongly for only one sanctuary or temple is acceptable in worshiping God. Finally, there is the priestly version, and this emphasizes priestly concerns, i.e., what is the role of the priests, legal concerns, this is where you're going to get your laws, this is going to get your methods of worship, and you're going to get your preservation of traditions that come out of the tradition of Moses and the genealogies. It is not usually in the storytelling style of, say, the Yahwist or the Elohist author groups. However, the priestly group was written probably around 550 to 450 BCE during the Babylonian exile, which we will talk about in a few weeks. But you'll notice there's about 400 years difference between the Yahwist writings and the priestly writings, and yet they are interwoven to look like they are simultaneous within the first 5 books. Specifically, we can find these 2 groups, the Yahwist and the priestly groups, in the creation myth stories in the beginning of Genesis. The first creation myth takes place in Genesis 1, and it goes through chapter 2, verse 4a. It was again written during the Babylonian exile at about 550 BCE. And by reading this, we can see certain themes, such as the absolute supremacy of Israel's God to other gods, that God is eternal and omnipotent. That is to say that there is no beginning and no end of God, and that God is everywhere. And that this God exercises undisputed control over the universe. That this God brought order out of chaos in order to create the world, and this God did so through the power of language. This God also establishes the Sabbath as the 7th day by stating that the 7th day God rested. Okay, so we begin to see, if we just read those, we begin to see this sort of non-storytelling, non-character development of God, right? But this very sort of, this is what happened, and this is what happened, and this is what happened, and God said this was good, and on the 7th day he rested. The second creation myth story was actually written much earlier than the priestly version. Okay, so even though the priestly version comes first, the second version is actually the one that was written first, probably around 950 BCE, about 400 years earlier. Therefore, we can see this idea that God, in sort of the same traditions, if you've read, Greek myth or Roman myth or Egyptian myth, anyway, that God has much more human qualities than in the priestly creation myth. Now, there is a different order of creation. Most significantly, the creation of humanity, when humanity was created within the scope of everything else, and especially a difference of when woman was created within that scenario. And this creation story emphasizes the bond not only between man and woman, but also between God and humanity, that this God actually cares about humanity, right? Why did God create these other things? To sustain the human. Why did God create the woman? To make the other human figure, what has become known to us now as man, but probably a much more androgynous figure, that person was lonely and that God was concerned about that loneliness. And so then he created, or this God created, something called woman. So this is essentially how the creation myths are developed in the Bible. Again, what we see is the first myth written 400 years later than the second myth. The one is an omnipotent God, very, very far away, doesn't really manifest any human traits. The second one, we see a God that's very concerned about humanity, creates the world in a different way, and takes on very human characteristics. Okay, so that gets us through the creation myth stories of the beginning of Genesis. I hope you have found this useful, and I will continue to create these videos as we proceed throughout the semester. Have a good day.